Hi, Mr. Bingman and I don't quite have the time this week to make a brand new brain building broadcast about neuroscience up to the usual standards. But we do want to give you a little bit of an intro so you can look at the following short presentation as like a podcast with pictures to introduce you to neuroscience. All right, let's get started. A neuron is a cell of the nervous system. Its shape or morphology is connected to its role for your body, which is to pass messages through your nervous system through a combination of chemical and neurotransmitters and electrical impulses. Just like other cells you have seen, a neuron has a nucleus. However, the neuron has also short branch-like appendages called dendrites and long appendages called axons. Dendrites receive electrical impulses, and axons pass along these impulses. The small gap between the dendrites and axons is called a synapse. Electrical signals stimulate chemicals that are called neurotransmitters that are able to traverse that synapse. Now, there are many parts of the brain, but it could actually be split into three main parts: the cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebrum is a large part of the brain that is split into the left and the right hemisphere, and those parts are further divided into lobes, such as the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. These parts of the brain are associated with higher order thinking, such as language, senses, personality, judgment, and planning. The Schoology assignment will take you to an interactive brain website. Pause the video and take a moment to look over the cerebrum and their functions. The cerebellum is under the cerebrum and has a role of coordinating muscle movements. The brainstem is the connection of the cerebrum and cerebellum to the spinal cord. It regulates involuntary automatic functions of your brain, such as breathing, heart rate, sleep cycles, and digestion. Much of our understanding of how the brain works is from case studies or real-life examinations of certain phenomena. One such case study is about a person from the early 1800s named Phineas Gage. He was a railway construction foreman who somehow survived an extremely traumatic brain injury when an iron rod was driven completely through his frontal lobe by accident, as you can see in the picture. His personality and behaviors abruptly changed after recovering from the physical injury. He seemed to lose inhibitions of what was appropriate for social situations and displayed a pretty volatile personality that he had not done so before. All his friends and acquaintances mentioned that he was no longer Phineas Gage after that accident, even though he survived. Your nervous system is a combination of voluntary and involuntary responses. Voluntary responses are deliberately executed by a person, like on purpose. Involuntary responses happen automatically. For example, pretend you want to eat potato chips, and the visual stimulation of potato chip bag is taken through your eyes and sent by your optical nerve to the part of your brain that's called the occipital lobe, which processes visual images. At the same time, you involuntarily begin to salivate as you are hungry. You voluntarily activate your muscles to contract to pick up the bag and try and open it. However, you cannot. In your frustration, you chuck the bag across the room just as your sister walks into its path. That is also a voluntary response that used your cerebellum when you threw it. Your sister flinches as the chip bag hurtles towards her head and then she jumps out of the way. This is an automatic response or an involuntary response on her part because she automatically needed to get out of its way. Some involuntary responses or reflexes exist only at birth to increase a baby's chance of survival. For example, babies have a grasping reflex that if anything touches their palm, they close their fingers around that object. I get you feel like a baby really loves you when her tiny hand grasps your fingers and holds it so tight, but it's really just some automatic response. Sorry. In addition, you could see this picture of an early behavioral psychologist by the name of John B. Watson, and he is demonstrating this reflex in a newborn. Obviously, this was taken when researchers had loose ideas of child welfare in science. So yeah, don't do that to a newborn baby, and we'll talk a little bit more about John B. Watson later on. Now, you never really grow out of some involuntary responses. For example, you go to the doctor's office and you automatically kick when certain nerves and muscles in your knee are hit with a small hammer. There is another early psychologist named Ivan Pavlov. He found that you can classically condition an organism to have an involuntary response. So you can have involuntary responses that you learn rather than involuntary responses that you are just born with. Dogs automatically salivate when presented with food. In his experiment, he would ring a bell and present a dog with food immediately after. After doing this repeatedly over a long period of time, he found a change. He found that when he rang the bell, the dog automatically salivated even if food wasn't present. The dog was conditioned to respond to the bell. We used to do this presentation live in class. We inserted the sound of the school's bell at this point, and almost always, a kid would just automatically stand up like they were leaving. Just wanted to demonstrate that you can also be classically conditioned as well. But that was just us messing with you. Back to our ethically questionable psychologist friend John B. Watson. So Watson learned about classical conditioning of Pavlov's dogs, and he thought to himself, that's so cool. I want to do this to people. So he obtained a baby from a woman who worked in his building, known as Little Albert in his research. He decided to find out if he can classically condition a phobia into a baby. It is said the mom had no idea of the nature of the experiment. They presented Little Albert with a rabbit, and he had no fear of it. However, they then crashed a steel bar against a hammer behind him, making a frightening noise that made Little Albert cry. They repeatedly did this over a period of time to poor Little Albert until he cried at the mere sight of a rabbit or anything furry, like rats or even a fur coat. So there you go. John B. Watson learned that you can classically condition people, but I think after that, psychologists started having like some kind of standards of ethical research. If you enjoyed this information and you find it interesting, we highly encourage you to consider taking a psychology course when you go to high school. Some high schools even offer advanced placement or AP psychology, and you could get college credit. I can't really do justice to a really cool field like psychology and neuroscience in just a few minutes. But if you have any additional questions about neuroscience, feel free to come to myself or Mr. Bingman and pick our brains on the topic.